right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with a brand new guest, Meg Jones Wall, who wrote an amazing book called Finding the Fool. And it's subtitled A Tarot Journey to Radical Transformation. So, Meg, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have
Thank
this
you.
conversation.
Thank you so much. Me too. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, definitely. So, we have a ton to talk about in regards to your story, your faith journey, tarot, all the different things, how you got to the place where you wrote this book. But first, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, a general introduction to Meg. Who are you? What do you do? What do we need to know?
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Meg Jones Wall. I use both she, her, and they, them pronouns. Both are absolutely fine. Right now I live in Brooklyn, but I have lived all over the country and in a few other countries as well. I grew up evangelical. My parents were essentially Baptist church planters. I have ministers on both sides of my family going back. And got married young. But I found tarot during my Saturn return, honestly. In 2016, I had left the church, being queer, but also not really agreeing with some of the politics. I found tarot.
Politics in the church? I don't
I
know.
know. Can you believe
It's
it?
hard to believe.
I was like, this doesn't feel great for me. Found tarot as a way to try to open a different spiritual door, and I've kind of been going down that path ever since, and it's been great. So yeah, here we are.
And when was that year of that you got into tarot?
I bought my first deck in 2016 in the
Okay, so that's not
summer.
long
So
ago. That's not long
no,
ago
it's
at
not too
all.
long ago. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So maybe can you take us into your story a little bit? Because in the introduction, you have this quote, and I have it over here. You say, "When I was a kid, growing up in a conservative religious family of pastors and church planters, magic was considered a dirty word." So can you talk to us more about this world that you grew up in and the place where you are now, kind of how you got from there to here? Because a lot of our listeners are going to be new to tarot related
Mhm.
things, but the majority of them grew up in that conservative fundamentalist setting. So there's a lot of common ground, like you're speaking our
Yeah.
language. So maybe
Yeah,
take us into,
100%.
yeah, take us into that a little bit and what that looked like to move from that world to where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I was little, my
Mhm.
family moved from Southern California to New England,
Mhm.
and my parents found an Alliance church that they were attending. But fairly soon,
Christian Missionary Alliance.
I believe it was I actually don't know. I should
Okay.
look it up. It wasn't a church they were involved in very long. I
Gotcha.
was
Gotcha.
like 5.
Sure.
But they very quickly met a man who had come to plant a church with his family,
Mhm.
and they really aligned with his theology and his doctrine, and decided that they would leave the Alliance Church to help him become like some of the founding members. So the first church service was in my parents' house,
Mhm.
and they are still very involved in that church. 30 years later, my dad preached, was on the elder board, ran the music department. My mom headed up a lot of different steering committees and groups. And so as their eldest daughter, I was held to very high standards around being a leader in the church, being a role
Mhm.
model in the church, being a good Christian girl and following the rules and dressing appropriately and having appropriate relationships and
Yeah.
friendships and
Yeah.
hobbies and everything that goes along
The
with
whole
that.
9 yards.
Yeah, we were Baptist, we were Calvinist, we were very fire and brimstone, very anti-queer. It was very conservative, very
Yeah.
fundamentalist. And so I went to Bible college and ended up getting a minor in theology by accident because I kept trying to figure out if you could be a queer Christian all at the same time.
You just took all the
Um,
classes on theology, and before you know it, you have
Legit,
a
like
degree.
I even took like independent studies on the New
Right.
Testament. I was in there. I wouldn't have, if you had asked me at the time, that's not what I would have told you I was doing, but
Mhm.
I was sitting in every panel on homosexuality in the Bible.
Wow.
I was in the background of everything, trying to
Mm,
figure out how to rectify my faith and what I'd always been told about homosexuality and sin, with
yeah.
the relationship that I had with Jesus and
Mm,
the love that I felt from God, and
mhm,
trying to make those two pieces work. In
mm.
the And I know there are affirming faiths, but the one that I was raised in was not affirming at all,
Yeah, yeah,
and in fact was intensely harmful.
yeah. So what did it look like to step out of that world? Like, do you have any associations today with that former tribe, or have you moved completely from there?
I've moved pretty firmly away. It
Okay.
was not a clean break.
Okay.
It was not a, I woke up one morning and was like, I can't do this anymore. It was a very slow, gradual, attending less and less services,
Okay.
just creating more and more distance.
Yeah.
Um, prayer was always huge for me. I still pray a lot.
Hmm.
I just don't only pray to the Christian God
Yeah.
anymore. But yeah, leaving the relationship behind was a lot more complicated for me, and isn't really over exactly.
Yeah.
I don't quite know how to talk around that, but
Sure.
leaving the church to me felt very different than leaving God.
Yeah.
But because the church was where it felt like a lot of the harm had been done, and
Okay.
the specific doctrines and rules and um, kind of the shape that the church wanted me to take up as a person
Sure.
felt very different than the relationship that I had with God.
Sure. So did tarot come into the picture when you still had a kind of like one foot in the door, one foot out, or did tarot come into the picture
Yeah,
later
I think
on?
I was pulling that second foot out, I think.
Gotcha, kind of stuck in there, but trying to get it.
Yeah, well, because it's hard, I mean,
Yeah.
it wasn't just like me and my faith, it was also
Hmm.
my parents, my family, my grandparents and aunts and uncles and everyone that I knew. Like my whole life was built around the church and this faith. It's not
Yeah.
something that anyone does lightly to leave it behind. But I was also like incredibly depressed.
Hmm.
I was in a space of like self-harm and suicidal ideation, and several attempts that I survived. Like it's not a healthy thing to be
Yeah.
in at that point. And when you feel that alone and that scorned by God, it's a very difficult place to be in.
Yeah.
But you're also like trying to leave your life behind essentially, and try to build a new one. And reimagining your faith is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
So for me, it was very much like, how can I have or adjust my relationship with God and let the church can just be its own separate thing that I'm not
Yeah.
going to be involved with anymore, but how can I reclaim this relationship with God and expand it in a way that it feels like mine? Like how can I build a
Yeah.
spiritual practice that feels like mine and doesn't have these ties to the church, where then I find myself falling back into these rules and this like sense of censoring myself, or having
Sure.
to live a certain way. Like how can I reclaim God for myself and
Sure.
build a relationship that actually feels safe and affirming for me?
Yeah.
um and I'd never had a tarot reading. I didn't I didn't know very much about the cards, but I just kept thinking about them. They kept popping up in books I was reading, and
Yeah.
I couldn't stop thinking about them. And so I was finally like, well, let's give it a try.
Yeah.
What's the worst that can happen,
Right.
right?
Right. So you get you get, I'm assuming you went and you got a tarot deck. And
I
then
did.
what did it look like? What did the relationship with these cards look like as you first opened it? Because I imagine, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but me growing up in a similar kind of world, when I got my first deck, the internal Christian soldier was like, "Burn those cards.
What are you doing?
You're
Yeah,
going to
get rid of
hell."
them. You're doing something wrong. Yeah, I really had this. It was very much a sense, like, I think that was part of what held me back from buying them.
Yeah.
I had a few things, but like months and months went by where I was thinking about the cards and wanting the cards, and I just kept getting in my head. I was Googling like, can Christians read tarot? Is tarot of the devil? Like,
Yep.
I wasn't raised, the church that I was raised in didn't talk very much about tarot or witchcraft or
Mhm.
anything. It wasn't super prevalent. um but I had a sense that, if people that I had grown up with knew that that's what I was doing, that there would be a lot of judgment, and a lot
Yeah.
of harsh words for me. So yeah, I finally got it together. I gathered my little scraps of courage and went to this bookstore, and I went to the Strand and bought my first deck. And I didn't know what to do with them. Like I
Mhm.
pulled them out, and so many of the books that I had read were like, yeah, I've been reading since I was 12, and it was so intuitive and natural. And I started pulling cards, and I was like, I don't know what any of this means. Like, I
Yes.
don't like, this is a drawing of a stick on a card, and I don't know, I don't know
Right. What
what
is
this
that supposed
means.
to mean for my
What am I?
life?
Yeah, I was like, I don't know what that is. And it felt, can I swear? It felt like
Yeah.
shit. Like
Yeah.
it felt terrible. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I've been thinking about this nonstop. And I finally did a brave thing and
Mhm.
stepped way outside my comfort zone and bought this thing, and like it was a mistake. Like, this isn't for
Mm.
me. I can't do this. Is this God telling me like that this was a mistake? Like
Yeah.
all the things that you do when you're like, have I done something wrong? So yeah, the first 6 months, the first year really was a huge struggle. Every time I
Yeah.
picked them up, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And it
Mm.
didn't feel wrong, but it did
Mhm.
feel like I didn't know how to I did not know how to read them.
Sure.
um yeah.
So did you get like did you go to like to the bookstore and try to find books on tarot cards to try to help you understand what they're about? Because I have that I had that sense too. Like when I first got
Mhm.
the cards, I opened them up and I'm like, I'm just gonna look at them. You know, it's
Yeah.
gonna be intuitive. That's what everybody says.
Yeah.
And I
That's what
open them
everybody
up. I'm
says.
like, what is this? Like I don't know what I'm looking at. And then you try to do a
Yeah.
maybe I'll try a spread, and that was even more confusing because
Oh,
now I've got not
yeah.
just one card, I've got like four cards in front of me. I don't know what
Yeah.
any of them
Oh
mean.
my God, my first spread, I tried to do the Celtic cross. What was I
Oh no.
thinking? 10 cards? Like
Yeah.
absolutely not. I still don't use that spread.
Right.
But yeah, like it's so overwhelming. And yeah,
Yeah.
like so many of the resources do say it's intuitive. Just read what you see. And I was like, how?
Hmm.
I don't understand that. So yeah, I would pull a card a day.
Yeah.
I still do, but I
Hmm.
would pull a card a day, and then yeah, I would spend like an hour or two looking at all my favorite websites. I'd have my little white book open and then all the other
Hmm.
books that I bought. It was like Bible study. Like I would literally be
Yeah.
sitting on my bed
Yeah.
with websites and papers and my notes and books spread all around, and I would focus all of my energy on deciphering this one card, trying to
Yeah.
figure out what it was telling me.
Yeah.
Um
I
yeah.
think that's an interesting parallel because a lot of our listeners get that idea of Bible study or morning
Mhm.
devotions, right? Like when you spend your time with the Bible and you're trying to see what does
Mhm.
God have to say to me today. I feel like
Mhm.
that's the sense I almost get with the cards. Like when I'm pulling one card a day, there's a lot
Mhm.
of times I'll open up a book like your book, which we'll get to in a minute, or another book, and I'll have my Bible there, and I almost see like there's like a parallel between
Mhm.
things, and like I feel like I can sense the universe or God or whatever it is speaking something to me about
Mhm.
my life, and that has a lot of parallels back to my old days, which
Mhm.
I think breaks down the walls a little bit. Like it makes it feel less threatening and less scary, especially for those of us who are told that this is demonic and evil and things like that.
100%.
Yeah.
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 No, I mean, having your Bible open with the tarot cards next to them, like it's all paper and ink. It's really just about what you're bringing to it and
Right.
what you're seeing in it. But
Right.
if you don't know how to see anything in a tarot card, if you don't know what it's trying to communicate, especially if you're using it alongside prayer, which is what I was doing a lot in the early
Yeah.
days, especially like
Mhm.
using it as a tool to try to speak with God in a more specific way. Um, if you can't figure out what it means, it doesn't feel great.
Right. Exactly.
And it feels like, why am I making this even more complicated for myself? Now I also feel inadequate, or like I
Yeah.
can't unpack what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. All right. So your book, tell us about maybe elevator pitch it for us if you would. Like who's the target audience of this book? What's it about? Most importantly, how is it different from other tarot books that are out there? Because I would argue, and we said this before we hit record, but I feel like it's the content of this book is very different from other books that
Mhm.
are out there. So maybe take us into that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, so Finding the Fool was really conceived as a book that was meant to make anyone feel welcome within the tarot,
Hmm.
regardless of who you are, where you come from, what your background is, what your identity is, what your culture is, but also how you want to use the cards, whether you want
Hmm.
to use them for religious and spiritual purposes, or just creative purposes, or self-reflection, or anything else.
Hmm.
I believe that the cards have space in all of those pathways for every single person who is interested in using them. I'm not interested in converting people to using tarot, but I am interested in offering support systems for people that want to use the cards, particularly if the first time you picked up a deck, you were like me and you, it sounds like, and didn't
Hmm.
know what to do with them, or
Yeah.
didn't like have a sense of how to get into the language of tarot, because it can
Hmm.
be really overwhelming. And so the really the big idea, the driving force behind this book was making a companion, not to tell you how to think or how to read, but to offer different pathways forward, so that on your own journey you don't feel alone, and you feel like
Yeah.
there's a voice there with you being like, yeah, that's fine. You don't know what that card means? Cool, me neither. Let's
Right.
figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. So your the one of the things I feel like the book really brings forward that I think it's probably prevalent in other books as well, but I feel like it's more there in your book is that these cards are representative of like a journey that a
Mhm.
human being, all of us, kind of like the human condition, all that we all go on. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what like tarot has come to mean for you personally in regards to that journey, kind of finding yourself in the journey, finding yourself in the archetypes of these cards and things like that. Like, what does that look like for you on a regular basis?
That's a great question. I think that for me, Tarot just helps me like kind of anchor myself in whatever present place
Hmm.
I'm in. um I don't use the cards predictively. I don't use them for divination really. It's for me, it's more that old adage, tarot is a mirror, not a crystal ball.
Hmm.
I very much use it as a tool for reflection and introspection,
Hmm.
and intuition. And so for me, it's a way to kind of tap into what I'm feeling in that moment, or what I might be trying to figure out. I find it really
Yeah.
useful as a tool for untangling complicated emotions, or if I'm not sure which path I want to take, it helps me create a space in order to do that, that doesn't have a right or wrong answer. It's just
Mm.
exploratory. And so I think for me, when I'm pulling cards, especially when I get like a major arcana archetype, or and there are some challenging cards in the deck, it
Hmm.
really captures all of the facets of human existence, not just the
Hmm.
happy positive ones, or the things that we might be striving for. um I find that the cards really meet me where I am,
Hmm.
and help give me an anchor into where I am in that moment, where I'm feeling in that moment. Even if that moment is challenging, even if I don't understand what's going on in a
Yeah.
particular moment,
Hmm.
it helps give me language and, yeah, clarity a little
Hmm.
bit around where I am and like what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to hear, is that it's the cards for you are help you understand the present moment
Hmm.
versus the future. Because I feel like that's a one of the, not the lie, but I feel like that's something that we've all been told,
Hmm.
is that these are about predicting the future, things like that. And I know that there are people who use them in that
Absolutely.
way, and that's fine. But I
Hmm.
think you don't have to use them that way. And I feel like it's important for people to hear that you can take these cards and you can introduce them to your own spiritual practice wherever you are. Like you said before, the book is speaking to you wherever you are in your journey. It's not telling you to revamp everything. It's not telling
No.
you to, you're doing it wrong, do it this way. It's here. If you want to get into these cards, you're already doing something, maybe they can fit in this way.
100%. Yeah, the cards are a tool and you can use them
Mhm.
for any number of things. I know writers that use them with no spiritual component
Mhm.
whatsoever. They just use them to inspire, help them figure out characters, or
Yeah.
untangle a plot point, or,
Mhm.
build some new layer into their work. I certainly know people that use them, predictively or for divination, and there are certain techniques that you can use with the cards around that.
Mhm.
And then I know a lot of people like myself who just use them as a form of reflection, and an opportunity. It kind of helps you carve out some space for introspection, and I
Yeah.
think all of those things have value, but you don't have to use them in any particular way.
Mhm. Yeah. So can you tell us about, could you maybe give us like a peek into a day in the life of Meg with these cards? Because a lot of people ask me, they're like, "Well, I'm trying to develop like a practice. I'm trying to
Mm,
introduce them to my life. Like, what does it
mhm.
look like for you to use the cards just on a regular, wake up to bedtime kind of day? Like, do you use them more in the morning? Do you refer to them back throughout the day? Is it kind of like pull one early on and that's kind of like your card for the day? Like, what does it look like for you on a regular basis?"
Sure. So, yeah, my regular practice
Mhm.
is not daily. I just want to make it very clear that I don't think that like routines are only good if you do them every single day or with
Yep.
consistency. Like, I think rituals and routines have value no matter how frequently or
Mm.
infrequently you visit them. But for me, generally, I pull a card in the morning,
Mhm.
and I usually just pull one. If my partner and I are reading for each other, which we do fairly frequently,
Mm.
sometimes we'll pull one, or sometimes we pull three. But I don't typically use spreads. I usually just pull a card. I take a moment for meditation, and just to
Mhm.
kind of like calm my mind, like,
Mhm.
kind of acknowledge any thoughts that are tangling around. If I have something in particular I want to draw for, I'll try to kind of clarify that.
Mhm.
But often I just kind of ask, what do I need to be aware of today? What's
Mhm.
something I should be thinking about today, or something I need to know? And I shuffle and I breathe and I pull a card, and I'll take a few minutes to kind of journal about it. Sometimes I put those things on Instagram. Sometimes I just keep them for myself. Um, but yeah, that's kind of it. And so I don't use it as like a what is today going to hold for me, or like
Mhm.
what's going to happen today, or what should I be doing today. For me, it's much more what's an energy to be paying attention to, or
Mhm.
what's something within me that I might not have realized is there right now.
Mhm.
And then I can look at the card through that lens as just kind of an invitation and an awareness.
Yeah.
And I don't always find it comes up very obviously throughout the day. Sometimes it's just if it's like the Four of Swords, it's like, hey, what if you rested?
Right.
Then I'll try to be like, okay, I can do that. I
Yeah.
can rest. But sometimes it's less clear. Sometimes it's like, oh, interesting. I wasn't expecting to see the Knight of Wands today.
Yeah.
And so then I can kind of be aware of, okay, what's an opportunity to pay attention to fire? Where is my
Mhm.
creativity manifesting, and how do I
Mhm.
want to tap into that today?
Yeah. I think that's important too because like I feel like a lot of books out there say you've got to ask specific questions to the cards or the
Mm.
universe or whatever. Like you have to have don't come to the deck unless you have a specific thing in mind that you want to ask. And sometimes I feel like I don't have anything specific to ask, So then I'm
Yeah.
like, I'll sit there for waste, not wait, like use my whole time that I have allotted to this moment thinking about a question that I don't really have. But I think it's helpful to hear that you can just say, well, what do I need to know
Yeah.
for today? What do I need to know in this moment? What am I missing in this moment? I have this
Yeah.
thing going on in my
That can be a good
life.
one too.
There's lots of different angles to look at this from. Like
Mhm.
shine a light on an angle that I'm missing so I can see something maybe that I didn't see before.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of tarot books that have a lot of rules in them, like that you have to do this, or you don't ever do
Sounds
this.
like the church.
I know. Can you believe when I first started reading and I was finding all these books with all these rules, I was like, fuck. And then I just like jump out of
Try
one
to get
fire
away
and
from
into a
this,
different
right?
ones. I know. I'm
Come
like,
on.
I don't want this. Um, and some of those rules are good. Like I don't think,
Yeah.
I think the only hard and fast rule is don't use tarot cards to manipulate or scare other
Mhm.
people. Like I think that's the only hard and
Okay.
fast rule I have about it. But
Yeah.
otherwise, it's like use them for what is going to build you up and support you and help you explore, and that's kind of it. Like
Yeah.
whatever form that takes can be anything. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I think just coming to the cards with like, what do I need to hear today? What do I need to be
Yeah.
thinking about? What's a way to reframe this thing that's been in my head?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be more specific than that. It can be. It certainly can
Sure.
be. And I think that's where spreads come in
Mhm.
handy. But if you just want to give yourself, 10 minutes for like self-reflection, and you want to
Mhm.
pull a card about it, like I think that's a really great way to engage with the cards in a way that feels not too stressful or
Yeah.
intimidating.
Right, right. So talk to us about like picking a deck. That's another thing that I
Mm,
get a lot. People have asked me like
hmm
about picking decks. And Stephanie was on the show, Stephanie Capone. She talked to us
hmm
about that.
Yeah, she's great.
Brittany Muller was on the show. She talked to us
I
about
love
that
Brittany.
too. But what
Yeah.
are some of your thoughts about picking a deck? Because I went to the bookstore before I got my first deck. I'm like, oh, I was going to go
hmm
there and get a deck, And there's a whole like wall. It's like a Bible. It's like
There's
the
so
Bible
many.
section.
It
There's
is
like
like the
so
Bible
many different. I
section.
don't know
Yeah.
what to pick. Like there's so many different
You're like, I
ones, and
haven't researched all these translations. Like, what does this one mean?
yeah,
Like, what
so
am
I
I
went
doing?
home without anything because I was like, this is
Yeah,
just too overwhelming.
that's
So I went to
so real.
Amazon and got like a basic one, and then
Yeah.
then I felt more comfortable. But what are some of your thoughts about picking a deck for people?
Yeah, so the way that I recommend people choose decks is
Mhm,
is kind of like part of my tarot philosophy, which is
mhm,
that working with the cards is about building a relationship with yourself and with the
mhm,
deck. And so it's really about what kind of conversations you want to be having with yourself.
mhm,
And so when you look at all of the thousands and thousands of beautiful decks that are out there are a lot of recommendations to start with certain kinds of decks. The
mhm,
Rider-Waite-Smith is usually the one that's often recommended to beginners. But if that artwork doesn't speak to you, it didn't speak to me.
mhm,
If you don't feel connected to it, if you don't feel inspired by it, these are images you're going to be working with potentially on a daily basis, maybe
mhm,
even multiple times a day if you end up being a professional, or you
mhm,
just are someone that wants to use them a lot, especially in like your work or creative practice. These are images you're going to be engaging with in a highly personal and intimate way. And so if the
yeah,
images don't feel good for you, if they don't intrigue you, if they don't speak to you, then that's not a deck you should be forcing yourself to work with.
yeah,
I learned that lesson the hard way. Like I mentioned a couple things held me back from buying my first
mhm,
deck, and one of them, the biggest one, was certainly like the church, and like, is this going to cause me to stumble? Like, what are we doing
yeah,
here? But the other thing was that every resource I found was telling me to buy this Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and I don't
mhm.
like it. I just,
Right,
it's not my jam. I just don't,
yeah,
I don't have anything against it. I mean,
yeah,
I suppose I have a few things against it, but I don't think it's a
sure,
bad deck to use, but it did not speak to me. And every time I did the thing where you put the deck in your digital cart and then you just like don't check out.
yep,
I did that like at least a dozen times. I
yep,
just could not get myself to buy this deck. But then it made me afraid to buy any other deck because I thought I
mhm,
was going to do it wrong. Um, but really the deck you should buy is the deck you want to spend time with. It's the
Yeah.
deck you want to be having a conversation with. It's a deck that you feel drawn to, and that you feel like the artwork really speaks to you. That's going to be the best deck for you to start with.
Yeah.
There are certainly decks that are more beginner friendly than others. I would not recommend starting with a highly complex deck, or a deck that doesn't have clear numbers or names
Hmm.
on them.
Hmm.
But I don't think there's a wrong deck to start with. It's really about one that you were going to be excited to reach for on a daily
Hmm.
basis, one that feels like friendly and good for you.
Hmm.
If you're not drawn to the cards, then every time you pick them up, you're going to be kind of like, ugh, okay,
Yeah.
and that's not what you want.
Sure. Are there different decks that like are focusing on different things? I don't know
Mhm.
how, I don't know if I asked that correctly, but like I've looked around at the store and I feel like I've seen
Mhm.
some that are very like very dark, for lack of a better word. Like they're
Mhm.
very dark, very dreary, and like it seems
Mhm.
like they're trying to draw you into a certain aspect of yourself, where others are like super bright and colorful
Mhm.
and they're trying to draw you a different way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasoning behind those different things. I
Hmm.
think aesthetic preference is real.
Sure.
But also I do think that there are a lot of very intentionally lighthearted and friendly decks, like
Hmm.
soft decks that like especially like will rename or reskin like the scary cards of the
Hmm.
tarot. And I think that in large part that is because of not only the way that the church has vilified things like tarot,
Hmm.
but also just the general depiction of tarot in books and media and film. We see them as like this really esoteric, like hard to access magic that is going to cause harm. You pull a
Yeah.
certain card and it's a sign of doom to come and all
Like
of
the
these
death
things.
card or
And
something, right?
yeah, or the
Yeah.
tower or the
Yeah.
three of swords. Certain cards become really vilified for people and become really
Hmm.
scary and can be really triggering.
Hmm.
um and that's real, and some people want to have a softer, friendlier approach to tarot, and honestly I think that's fine.
Yeah.
If that's going to help you not feel afraid of your deck, which is
Hmm.
again not what you want, like,
Hmm.
um then I think that can be helpful. I do generally caution people against like choosing decks that completely do away with any negative aspects, because I
Hmm.
do think that there can be comfort in having pain acknowledged in your
Sure.
readings.
Sure.
I think that that's an important thing to not leave out.
Yeah.
So I've seen advice to like take the cards that scare you out of your deck, and I'm like, if that's where you are, then don't read
Right.
with your
Don't
cards
don't
right
go
now. Like, give yourself a
there.
break. Like, that
Yeah.
tool is not going to be useful for you if that's if
Yeah.
that's where you're at. um yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I find interesting is we just talked about how, you pick up you purchase a deck or you get a deck based upon how it draws you in kind of thing, and
Hmm.
like you want to spend time with this, and it's about the pictures on the cards,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
like for me, I got the Rider deck first, and like I used it for a little while, but like you said, it didn't really speak to me. Just
Yeah.
like maybe I'm gonna try something else. So I got the Luna Soul
Oh
deck, and
yeah.
it's like super colorful, like very
Hmm.
pastel. I feel like it fits more my personality, and so I really
Totally.
enjoyed spending time in there. But in your book, you have no pictures in your
No.
book, which I thought was really interesting because we just talked about how important the pictures are to draw
Hmm.
you in, but your book has no pictures. Now, I have a lot of other tarot books that have pictures in them, but
Yeah,
yours doesn't. So maybe
most
talk
of
to
them
us
do.
about that. Like, why did you leave pictures out of your book?
Absolutely. So I had to fight really hard to not have pictures in my book. There are just, for anyone listening, there are just hand-drawn glyphs of
Mhm.
astrological, elemental, and planetary symbols, which I actually drew myself.
Mm.
So it's a very text-forward book.
Mhm.
And the reason for that is because I think that even if the book itself is telling you you can use any deck you want,
Mhm.
but then it has pictures of a specific card and is
Mhm.
spending a lot of its time talking about the imagery on that specific card, it's still going to end up feeling like that book is the most useful if you're using a specific kind of deck.
Yeah.
And so
Mm.
it was really important to me that this book feel accessible to anyone, no matter what deck they were using, and that instead of putting the emphasis on your choice of deck, it's really
Mhm.
about you engaging with whatever deck you have chosen.
Yeah. I think that's good because there's I have a couple other ones that I refer to sometimes, and they'll use like the rider deck
Hmm.
as their main thing, and they'll point to different aspects of the card
Hmm.
that's not on like my Luna Soul
Exactly.
card. And so then it's like I feel like, well, now what do I do? Like
Yeah.
if it's not fitting. But to your point, your book, I feel like it fits every deck. And was that hard to do? Like, was it hard to write about these different cards without making reference to a specific aspect of a specific card? Like, was it
Oh, that's an interesting question. No, it wasn't.
no?
But I love that question. I think it's been so ever since the beginning of my practice, I really have not put a lot of emphasis on picking apart the image of the
Okay.
card and like putting a lot of symbolism in the imagery,
Sure.
which I think you can do, and I think there's a lot of value in that. But especially when I started branching out into different decks, because at first I was like, I'm a one deck kind of gal.
Right.
I was a new King James person, and I'm going
Sure.
to be a wild unknown
Be
person, and
faithful
that
to
is
my
it.
deck,
Yeah, like faithful
right?
to my deck. But after like a year or so, I started to be like, well, okay, like what is the value of other decks? Why do people, and it's the same thing with using different translations of the Bible, like
Yeah.
different artists, different translators,
Mhm.
different scholars are going to find different aspects of these archetypes and these cards and tease them out in ways that helps you understand new facets of the card.
Mm.
I don't think it's necessary for every single person to have a million decks. I really don't. I live in a small Brooklyn apartment. I have too many decks.
Right.
But I do think that there is value in being able to read multiple decks and like
Mhm.
see what each different artist and illustrator or interpreter has brought to that card in particular, and like the ways that they draw that out or photograph it or whatever they're using helps you see different elements of the card. And
Yeah.
so that's always been part of my writing practice is talking about the meaning of the card versus the
Mhm.
imagery of the card.
Yeah.
And so it felt very natural in my book. It would have felt more unnatural to have them put in
Got
like
it.
commit to a specific deck, because it would have been the Rider-Waite-Smith. The way the copyright laws work for that deck, it's
Okay.
very easy for publishers to include those images, which is why
Okay.
they're in so many tarot books. But because I very famously do not use that deck. But also I really didn't want it. I didn't want it to feel like, okay, we're going to talk about this card generally, but I'm also going to
Yeah.
focus on this gesture that the magician is doing in this Rider-Waite-Smith version, because
Sure.
to your point, like I do think it can be really alienating, because then you're
Mhm.
like, do I have to look for this symbolism in my deck, and what if it's not here?
Right.
Like, what does that mean? And then you're kind of stuck in your interpretations because you're only limited to imagery that's on a deck that you don't even have.
Yeah, and that could be very distracting from, like, trying
Mhm.
to see what your specific card might be saying to you if you're trying to focus on trying to figure out, "How can I make this card fit into what this book is telling me?" kinda
Exactly.
thing. Yeah, it takes away from the
Yeah.
whole point of it. So your book also points to numerology
Mhm.
and, astrology. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk to us about the relationship between tarot and those 2 things, and how intensely someone, or maybe not intensely, someone who's new to all of this needs to jump into all 3, because I'll be honest, like, getting in the tarot has been eye-opening for me, but
Mm.
numerology and astrology confuses me. It also has layers of its own baggage attached to it, so it feels
100%.
safer almost to tackle kinda one of these things at a time instead of all 3. So, again, maybe talk to us about the relationship between these 3 and how someone who's new to all of this might start to dip their toes into it.
Absolutely. So I want to preface this by saying I'm not a tarot historian or a tarot scholar. My book does not include tarot history, really, because there are people out there that have done a much better job than me. With that, it's not my particular area of interest.
Sure.
And I will also say before I dive into this that it's absolutely not necessary to
Mm.
work with astrology or numerology to read tarot. You can just work with the cards, and it's
Mhm.
absolutely fine. But when tarot originally started to gather kind of steam,
Mhm.
the format of it was really largely based on numerology and elements. And so, especially with the minor arcana, when you would pull a card, it would just have a number
Mhm.
and the suit, kind of like our standard playing cards today. And there wasn't any pictures or imagery to go along with it. And so it
Mhm.
was really up to people's knowledge of numerology and elemental work to kind of develop whatever their interpretation of that combination of numbers and elements was going to mean, and how they
Mhm.
would read that for people. Um, and so part of the reason the Rider-Waite-Smith became so popular is because it really made it much more accessible to have this story locked into the minors in particular, and giving people a story that they could follow with a much clearer singular interpretation.
Mhm.
And so astrology kind of came in a bit later. The Order of the Golden Dawn, which is Crowley and Wade and all of those folks,
Mhm.
they kind of just decided that they were going to put some some astrological correspondences onto the cards. And so, you can use them if they're helpful. I find some of them helpful and some of them not, frankly.
Hmm.
And depending on how deep you are into astrology, I think it can be useful as an additional lens through which to view those cards. And
Hmm.
similarly, if you have a background in numerology or you're using a Marseille style deck, or that really appeals to you,
Hmm.
um, having the knowledge of numerology can be useful in your interpretations, which is why I include both of those things, because they have been helpful for me in my own studies.
Hmm.
But I think that, yeah, if you come into tarot being like, okay, I have to also be an astrology expert, and I also have to
Hmm.
be a numerology expert, and I also have to like know the elements really well, and I have to be like an art historian or something,
Right.
it's way too many things.
I don't have enough time.
um, yeah, and nobody has time for all of that. But
Yeah.
for me, numerology in particular was really useful in kind of my tarot breakthrough, so to speak.
Yeah.
I was reading, I had been really struggling with the cards, and I'd quit them a few times. I kept being like, this doesn't work for me. I
Hmm.
don't understand. How am I supposed to memorize 78 card meanings? Why does the story progress the way that it does?
Hmm.
Um, and when I found an article talking about the numerology of tarot, and talking about how all of the aces are going to have similar energy, and all of the fours are going to have similar energy across suits, and that really helped me to be able
Hmm.
to figure out, oh, this structure that's baked right into the cards is actually really useful for understanding how each of these cycles progresses, and how I
Yeah.
can map the majors onto the minors, and how I can find all of these additional meanings beyond just like a few quick keywords that I was having trouble just straight up memorizing.
Yeah.
It really gave me a structure to sink into. And so it was really important to me to include both of those things in the book, because for me, numerology, it just made such a difference in my understanding of working with the cards.
Yeah. So do you think is it like thinking of your book in particular, would you advise is the best way to do it? Is it to read the book straight through? Is it to because I feel like for me, like I sometimes I'll pull a card and I'll pull the same card multiple
Hmm.
times. And so
Hmm.
I'm in the same places of these books for long
Hmm.
periods of time and I never make it through a book. Like is it helpful to read like maybe your whole book to understand to get a picture of the storyline of these cards? And then also use it on a like a random
Hmm.
basis? Like, what's the best way to use your book or any of these books, really?
I mean, I am a nerd. I am a Gemini rising. I am someone that like loves information. And so
Yeah,
I do, when I get a new tarot book, I do actually just sit and read it cover to
read it.
cover. But I,
Yeah.
I think that that's unusual. And maybe it's because I'm a professional tarot reader. Maybe it's because I'm a writer.
Yeah,
I'm just the way that I'm wired. Like
sure.
I will absolutely just sit and read a tarot book cover to cover and read through every card description.
Mhm,
Um, I don't think that's necessarily how you have to use my book. The early sections, there's a forward and an introduction for me,
mhm,
and then there's an intro sections, so to speak, for
mhm,
I think it's called preparing the journey,
mhm,
that kind of sets up how to use the book, and where tarot comes from, and why we incorporate all of these different numerology and astrology, these different correspondences, and
mhm,
and different ways that we can use the cards. Um, and so I think that's valuable for anyone
mhm.
to read on getting the book. um I mean, I'm not going to tell you not to read the book, but I do think that if it feels overwhelming to just sit and read about all 78 cards, then don't
Yeah,
do that.
yeah,
It's definitely set up to be a resource that you can return to again and again, and that you can grab when you pull a card and are like, I don't quite know how I feel about that, or
mhm,
what's a different way to view this. I think especially when people use spreads,
mhm.
if a card comes up in a certain position and you're like, what the fuck does that mean?
Right.
That card doesn't have anything to do with this position. It doesn't answer my question. I don't understand what this card is doing here.
Yeah.
That's when I think tarot resources can be particularly helpful. And that's when I
Mhm.
hope that my book in very much particular will be very helpful, because it
Yeah,
it offers a lot of different lenses to view each card through, and can
sure.
give you perspectives on what the card might be trying to tell you, that
Mhm.
you wouldn't necessarily jump to first otherwise.
Yeah, so good. Okay, last thing. Would
Mm.
you mind bringing our time to a close by giving us like a reading of
Yeah.
something, pulling a card for us? Because both Stephanie and Brittany did this for us, and it was pretty cool because they both just to hear their insight into the cards was a lot of fun. So
Yeah.
if you could do that for us and maybe share some wisdom,
I'd be
We
happy
will all
to.
receive it.
I'd be happy to, yeah. So I pulled this deck. This is called the This Might Hurt Tarot.
Mhm.
It's by my friend Isabella Rotman, and the Ten of Cups was on the bottom, which is
Mm.
cute. But this deck is kind of a modern redraw of the Rider-Waite-Smith.
Okay.
So if you have any listeners that use the Rider-Waite-Smith, this should feel accessible.
Mhm.
And if anyone doesn't have it and doesn't want to have it, this still feels modern and inclusive enough
Team
that
Meg.
we have space for it. Exactly. Join my party, won't you? Is there anything in particular? Are we just pulling a card for the community? Is there anything in particular you'd like me to read for?
um,
Do you want me to
I
read
th
you a card?
yeah, sure. Let's see. I don't know. I think it's for a lot of us. I think
Mm,
we're all in this place of like deconstruction and like
mhm,
rethinking our whole faith journey and
mm,
just like what we've
mhm.
all been raised with. And I think there's a lot of people coming against significant pushback from their families and their churches. So I think we're all kind
Yes.
of in that place of, am I going in the right direction? Am I,
Mm,
what should I be looking for as I kind of make my way through this journey? So I
mhm.
think that would be the thing I would place before the cards. Yeah.
Okay. And frame that into a question. What do listeners need to hear about being faithful to self,
Yes.
perhaps?
Perfect.
Hmm. I love it. All right. I'm going to pull 3 cards here.
Okay.
Red. All right. So the first card that I pulled is one of my favorites, and I'm really
Mhm.
glad that I pulled this card because I think that it is one of those cards that people that are new to tarot or have been reading for a long time have a lot of feelings about. So the
Mhm.
card I pulled is the Three of Swords.
Mm.
And so I don't typically describe imagers because that's not really part of my practice, but would you like me to describe the image on this card
Yeah,
or
that way
not?
people who aren't watching can just
Yeah.
hear what we're seeing. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so this Three of Swords, it looks like a goose. I don't know
Mhm.
why I said that weird. It looks like a goose. Um, and it is kind of falling through the sky with some rain clouds and some rain falling on it. And it has been pierced by 3 swords. It's a very dramatic
Mhm.
looking little card here. And generally, the kind of traditional or classic interpretations of this card is betrayal.
Mm.
We tend to talk about the Three of Swords as a card of being let down by someone, being harmed by someone, or hurt by someone, or doing harm or betraying
Mhm.
someone else. And that meaning really comes from the suit of swords is associated with the element of air. It's the
Mhm.
mind, it's communication, it's information and insights. It's also truth. And 3 is a number of expression. And so
Mm.
if we think about speaking carelessly or
Mhm.
speaking truth, but not really being concerned about someone else, being more concerned about what we want to say,
Mhm.
that can obviously do a lot of harm.
Mm.
And so that's where that kind of classical meaning tends to come from. If you have a little white book, that meaning is probably the one that's in it if it's a Rider-Waite-Smith style deck. But I really love this card actually because I
Mm.
think it is an invitation to pay attention to the truths that come from within us,
Mm.
even if we don't immediately understand them or know what to do with them.
Mm.
3 is associated with generosity and outpouring, and it can be kind of messy. It can be kind of raw. You know, the first time that we express an idea or a creative process, it's not necessarily going to be perfectly refined yet, and that's
Mm.
where some of the challenge can come from, right? Some of the stickiness, but there's also a real authentic value into what comes out of us unfiltered.
Mhm.
And I think especially in a spiritual journey, paying attention to the truths that resonate with us, even if they force us to then consider, okay, how is that truth maybe harming me, or how is
Mhm.
that truth impacting me, or how is that influencing what else I seek out?
Yeah.
Giving ourselves the space to really process and reflect on that is a really important part of the process, and especially when we're in the midst of deconstructing or looking at our faith with a more critical lens.
Yeah.
Those things that have caused us harm in the past or are causing us harm at present are really important to pay attention to. I
Yeah.
think, especially, I mean, for any of your listeners that are queer
Mhm.
and grew up evangelical, it's a really harmful place to be sometimes, depending on your church and your faith. But brushing that under the rug doesn't do us any favors, right?
Yeah.
We have to look at that critically, and we have to be real about that so that we can actually process that hurt and deal
Yeah.
with it, instead of burying it and letting it continue to
Yeah.
fester.
Yeah. That's so good.
So that's the first card.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
pulled 2 clarifying cards just to kind of add some extra juice to it, because the
Okay.
3 of Swords can, make people feel some kind of way.
Yeah.
And I actually pulled 2 majors as kind of the extra. So the first one is the Lovers, which really shows I'm not gonna assign them genders, but there are 2 figures here, and it's a very Garden of Eden, naked hug in a beautiful natural looking space with trees and flowers. There's joy here, there's trust here. There is an angel overhead, with a bow, hanging out in the clouds. And that's our Lovers card. That's a 6. And then we also have the Wheel of Fortune, which is our 10 card. And in this one, we kind of see a Sphinx looking figure, with a wheel and a sword and a snake. The Wheel of Fortune is kind of that, one of the midpoints of the major arcana. And so these cards together are both really about choice and surrender. 6 as an archetype, is really tied to responsibility and duty, but it's also about celebrating how far we've come. And with 6, we have kind of moved past a point of friction or challenge and are really starting to embrace what things look like now that we've made some difficult, complicated choices. It's taking responsibility for those choices, but also celebrating the paths that those choices have allowed us to now walk. And so with the Lovers, we often think about community, we think about partnerships, we think about the people that see us for who we are.
Yeah.
And so in thinking about that spiritual journey and thinking about the 3 of Swords, who lets you live in your truth? Like who in your life, who in your community, who in your world, is willing to sit with you in those moments where you want to be your full self, even if it costs something, or even if it requires some kind of change. Who do you trust to sit with you in those messy moments, and how do you allow those people to also celebrate with you? And with the Wheel of Fortune, we tend to think about control and surrender. This card often gets tied to ideas of like destiny and fate and karma and luck. And as spiritual people, especially for anyone, I mean, I was raised Calvinist, so you have these ideas of predestination and
Tulip.
I know, like, oh God. Yeah, especially if you have these ideas of predestination, luck can feel like kind of a loaded term, but I tend to think of the Wheel of Fortune more as the forces that are beyond our control, no matter what you attribute those to, whether you contribute it to God's will or anything else. There are things outside of us that none of us have control over. Gravity, things that just move around us that we cannot personally impact. And so the wheel often asks us to pay attention to what we can control and what we cannot control. What patterns are we in that we have agency over, and what patterns are we in that we perhaps have less influence over than we realize? And how do we tie those things together? How do we find ourselves connected to that broader map of the world and the universe? And how do the things that we choose to do influence and impact those around us? None of us lives in a vacuum, none of us lives in a bubble. The things that we do matter to other people, the things that we say, the things that we feel. And so all of these cards really speak to choice. But they're about being really deliberate with our choices. How do we choose to accept truth? How do we choose to engage with truth? How do we allow ourselves to be supported through truth? And how do we surrender to certain truths? I think that's what I would leave your listeners with.
That's so good. I thank you for sharing those
Yeah.
cards with us and just for giving us those thoughts. And it's funny because before you hopped on Zoom, I had my cards here and I was talking to God, and I was saying, I was thinking about the podcast, thinking about my journey, and thinking about some of the recent pushback I've received, and just feeling rather defeated. And the card I pulled was the Lover's card,
Oh, I love that.
which is what you just shared with
We love
us.
a synchronicity.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? But that's
Great.
really cool. So thank you for sharing
Oh,
that.
my pleasure.
And
Can I
yeah,
ask what you saw in that card? Do you mind sharing that? I haven't.
yeah,
Podcasts are always funny for me because I always want to ask a million questions back, but I know that's not always how it works.
yeah. I think
But
for me it was just that piece about relationship, and about the
mm,
piece about just knowing what voices to listen to. Because on this card, it's the Luna Soul card. I
mhm.
don't know if you can see it, but there's this angelic feature at the top, and
Yeah,
she looks like she's shooting
beautiful.
some kind of beam almost down to this
Mhm.
woman. And that beam is going over to the guy, and it felt like to me, it was know where your strength comes from. It doesn't come from, you know, the opinions of other people. It doesn't come
Mhm.
from that commenter on YouTube. It doesn't come from those places. It comes from the divine. It comes from within, and that's
Mhm.
the voice you need to listen to. So it was just a refresher for me.
I love that. Yeah, I think the lovers really taps into that. Like it's your life. Who are you listening to? Who are you
Yes.
letting lead it? Like how
Yeah.
are you making your choices for yourself? Are you making them for someone else?
Yeah.
And how is that manifesting actually in
Yeah.
your actions?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
good. Well, hey, we're just about out of time, but this has been so much fun. Thank you for taking the time to join us and share with us your story and your amazing
Thank you
book.
for having me. This has been so wonderful. It's been really great to chat with you, Glenn. Thank
Yeah, for
you.
sure. And real quick, anywhere you want to point us to online, your Instagram
Oh,
handle or any
sure.
kind of website, anything like that?
Yeah, you can find me at megjoneswall.com and 3amtarot.com. I'm on Instagram at 3am.tarot. I'm on Twitter or whatever Twitter is right
Whatever it
now,
is.
at Meg
Train
Jones
wreck.
Wall. I know, God. But yeah, Instagram and my newsletter on which you can find via my website are going to be the best ways to follow me. So
Awesome.
yeah,
I'll put the links in the show notes and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
thank you. Would love to.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much, Glenn.